$8 million is gone. My sister's voice tore through the speaker so sharply I had to pull my Buick onto the shoulder of Interstate 77. Cars rushed past in a blur of silver and sunlight. Somewhere in the distance, a truck horn moaned across the Carolina hills. Rebecca was screaming. "You stole it, don't deny it. Evelyn, Daddy says you're the only one who could have done this." I sat there gripping the steering wheel, staring at the long ribbon of highway disappearing north toward Ohio. For a moment I said nothing. Then I smiled. Not because I was happy. Not because revenge tastes sweet the way people imagine. At 61 you learn that revenge is rarely sweet. Usually it tastes like old coffee gone cold while you were too busy surviving to drink it. Still I smiled, and said the only sentence that mattered. "Check the trust paperwork Daddy made you sign." The silence on the other end was immediate. Sharp. Breathless. Then, "What?" I hung up. And as the Carolina pines blurred outside my windshield, I thought back to the wedding. To the moment I should have seen coming all along. I had driven nearly 18 hours from Chillicothe, Ohio to Charleston, South Carolina. At my age, that kind of drive sits in your bones for days. My shoulders ached. My right knee throbbed every time I pressed the brake. By the time I crossed into Charleston County, my hands had stiffened around the steering wheel like old roots. But I had come anyway. Because when your younger sister invites you to her wedding after nearly 6 years of silence, some foolish part of your heart still hopes. Rebecca had called me herself. That alone was unusual. Her voice had been bright and practiced the way saleswomen sound when they've memorized friendliness. "Evelyn, I'd really like you there." I remember sitting at my kitchen table staring at the phone. For a moment she sounded like the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. Not the polished Charleston socialite she'd become. Not the woman who once introduced me at a charity dinner as my practical older sister from Ohio. Practical. As if I were a pair of orthopedic shoes. Still I said yes. Because hope is an old habit. The wedding was being held at Magnolia Crest, one of those sprawling plantation-style event estates just outside Charleston, where everything smells faintly of gardenias and expensive expectations. White columns. Perfect lawns. Imported roses arranged by people who charge more for flowers than I spend on groceries in a month. I parked my 12-year-old Buick between a Bentley and a silver Mercedes that probably cost more than my farmhouse. I remember looking at my reflection in the rear-view mirror. Gray streaks at my temples. A navy dress I'd bought on clearance at Macy's. Pearl earrings Mama gave me when I turned 40. Plain. Respectable. Forgettable. I'd spent my whole life being those things, and somehow it had never been enough for my family. I stepped out into warm coastal air and walked toward the entrance, carrying the gift I'd spent 3 weeks choosing, a handmade walnut jewelry box from an Amish craftsman outside Columbus. Solid. Beautiful. Built to last. The kind of thing I thought a marriage ought to resemble. There were already guests arriving. Women in flowing pastel silk. Men with polished loafers and voices too loud for sincerity. A valet glanced at my Buick keys and looked disappointed. I smiled anyway. At 61, embarrassment loses some of its sting. You get too tired to carry it properly. I reached the front steps and stopped. Because my parents were standing there waiting. Harold and Margaret Carter. 83 and 79. Elegant as ever. Daddy in his cream summer suit, Mama draped in pale blue chiffon like Charleston royalty. For a moment I thought they'd come to greet me. That should have warned me. My family had never greeted me first. Mama's face tightened when she saw me. Not anger. Disgust. The familiar kind. The kind she'd worn since childhood whenever I reminded her too much of herself before beauty and money taught her better. "Evelyn," she said sharply. I smiled carefully. "Hello, Mama." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You need to leave." I blinked. "I'm sorry." Daddy wouldn't meet my eyes. Mama's expression hardened. Rebecca changed her mind. The words landed strangely softly, as though my mind refused to let them hurt all at once. She invited me. She reconsidered. I looked toward the reception hall beyond them. Music floated faintly through the open doors. Laughter. Crystal clinking. Life moving forward without me. "Mama." Her voice dropped to a hiss. "Don't you dare go near your sister." I stared at her. Then Daddy finally spoke. His voice was flat. "You've caused enough embarrassment." That one cut. Because I knew exactly what he meant. Not scandal. Not disgrace. My existence embarrassed them. The daughter who stayed in Ohio. Who balanced books for Carter Agricultural Holdings while Rebecca married money and moved south. The daughter who never sparkled. Never charmed. Never became someone worth displaying. A few nearby guests had begun watching. I could feel their polite curiosity. The wealthy always enjoy discreet humiliation. It gives them something to discuss over cocktails. I looked at my parents, at the people I had spent 30 years quietly protecting. And for the first time in my life I felt no urge to defend myself. No need to explain. No hunger to be chosen. I simply nodded, set the walnut box gently on the nearest marble side table, and turned around. No tears, no raised voice, no scene. Just silence. I walked down those wide white steps and back to my Buick while Charleston society pretended not to stare. Inside the car I sat for a long moment with my hands resting on the wheel. Then I started the engine and drove north. 2 days later, somewhere outside Wytheville, Virginia, Rebecca called screaming about $8 million missing dollars. And when I told her to check the trust paperwork Daddy had made her sign, I knew the Carter family had finally reached the moment truth demands payment. After I hung up on Rebecca, I sat on the shoulder of Interstate 77 and listened to the engine idle. The road hummed beneath the tires. A tractor-trailer thundered past, rattling the Buick, just enough to remind me I was still here, still moving, still a woman with places to go. For a while, I simply watched the Carolina sunlight fade into late afternoon gold. At 61, memory doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in layers. One moment you're staring at highway asphalt, and the next you're 17 years old again, standing in your father's office while your little sister twirls in the doorway wearing your prom dress. Rebecca had always liked taking things that were mine. Not because she needed them, because she could. She was 13 then, all honey blonde curls and effortless sweetness, the kind of child adults instantly adored. I had saved for 6 months to buy that pale green dress. Working weekends at Miller's grocery stocking canned peaches and sweeping floors. Rebecca had asked to try it on. Then she'd spilled grape juice down the front. By accident, she claimed. Mama took one look and sighed. "Well, Evelyn, these things happen. Don't pout." Daddy barely glanced up from the newspaper. And Rebecca smiled that tiny secret smile she wore whenever she won. That was my first real lesson in our family economy. Rebecca was cherished. I was expected. She was celebrated. I was useful. And usefulness, unlike love, is never spoken aloud. It is simply assumed. By the time we were adults, the pattern had hardened into law. Our father had built Carter Agricultural Holdings from almost nothing. When he was 27, he borrowed $20,000 against my grandparents' farm and bought 3 failing soybean properties outside Chillicothe. By 50, he'd turned those acres into one of Southern Ohio's most successful privately held agricultural firms. Not glamorous money. Quiet money. Land money. The kind that grows while people underestimate it. Daddy respected discipline above all else. Or so he claimed. But even as a girl, I noticed his standards bent strangely around Rebecca. When she dropped out of college after 1 semester to find herself in Charleston, he paid for the move. When she maxed out 3 credit cards furnishing her first condo, he quietly erased the debt. When her boutique failed 18 months later, he called it bad timing and covered the losses. Meanwhile, I stayed in Ohio. Worked through college nights balancing books at a local insurance office. Earned my CPA license at 26. Came home to help restructure Carter Agricultural's finances after Daddy made a disastrous expansion into ethanol futures. I saved the company that year. Not dramatically. Not with speeches. Just spreadsheets, negotiations, and 18-hour workdays. When the dust settled, Daddy nodded once and said, "Good girl." That was the closest thing to praise I ever received. Rebecca got champagne celebrations for surviving breakups. I got a nod for preserving millions. Funny how families teach you your worth. The truth is, I didn't stay because I was noble. I stayed because someone had to. Mama had no head for business. Daddy grew more stubborn as he aged. And Rebecca treated money the way some people treat weather, something that simply appears when needed. So I stayed, year after year, quietly protecting what all of them assumed would someday belong to Rebecca. I never resented the company itself. There's dignity in stewardship. What wore me down was the invisibility. The way people thank sunshine and forget the roots. 5 years ago, everything changed. Daddy called me into his office late one November evening. He was 78 then. Still broad-shouldered, still commanding, but slower. There were moments when his memory snagged unexpectedly. A misplaced file. A forgotten meeting. Small things. Easy to dismiss if you wanted to. I did not. He closed the office door and sat behind his desk, looking suddenly older than I'd ever seen him. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "I need your help." Something in his voice unsettled me. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were neurological evaluations from the Cleveland Clinic. Early-stage vascular cognitive impairment. Manageable for now. Progressive. I looked up sharply. He couldn't meet my eyes. "When did you find out?" 3 months ago." "Why didn't you tell me?" He gave a tired smile. "Because telling you makes it real." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something I never expected to hear. "You're the only one I trust with this company." I stared at him. Not because I hadn't known. Some truths live between people long before they're spoken. But hearing it aloud felt like stepping onto unfamiliar ground. He leaned forward. Rebecca would destroy it in 5 years, maybe less. The words were blunt, painfully honest. And for the first time in my life, my father sounded afraid. "She means well," he added softly. "She means comfortably," I corrected. He almost smiled. Then his face grew serious again. "I need you to protect what I built." That night we spent 4 hours with James Whitaker, the family attorney. Together we created a trust structure neither Mama nor Rebecca fully understood. Rebecca would appear to inherit controlling liquid assets. Enough visibility to satisfy expectation. But hidden inside were legal triggers. If she attempted unauthorized liquidation of protected land or violated succession restrictions, full authority would automatically revert to me as trustee. Rebecca signed the paperwork 2 weeks later. She barely skimmed it. Marcus Hale sat beside her, smiling that polished Charleston smile of his. Even then I distrusted him. Too smooth. Too eager. A man who admired expensive things with professional hunger. Rebecca thought he adored her. I suspected he adored access. Still, I said nothing. Sometimes people need room to reveal themselves. And now, parked beside a Virginia highway with Rebecca's accusation still echoing in my ears, I knew exactly what had happened. Marcus had convinced her to liquidate Carter acreage. Probably to fund some dazzling investment or rescue some hidden debt. She had signed transfer authorization she wasn't legally allowed to execute. The trust had triggered automatically. $8 million transferred into protected corporate control. Not stolen. Safeguarded. Exactly as designed. My phone rang again. "Daddy's number," I answered. His voice was trembling. "What have you done?" Not hello. Not Evelyn. Just accusation wrapped in fear. I closed my eyes. For 61 years I had carried this family's burdens without complaint. And still, when truth arrived, they assumed betrayal wore my face. I opened my eyes and stared north. Toward Ohio. Toward home. And answered calmly, "I didn't do anything, Daddy." I paused. Then said the words that would change everything. "The system did exactly what you asked it to." For several seconds all I heard on the line was my father breathing. Short, uneven pulls of air like a man trying to outpace panic with denial. Then came the sound of my mother in the background. Sharp, clipped Charleston vowels. "What is she saying?" put me on speaker. Daddy didn't answer her. Instead, he spoke directly into the phone, his voice low and strained. "Evelyn, tell me this is some kind of misunderstanding." I leaned back against the seat and looked out through the windshield at the westbound traffic rushing toward evening. Cloud shadows stretched over the Blue Ridge foothills. The world kept moving. It always does, no matter how badly a family is coming apart. "It isn't a misunderstanding," I said. "It's enforcement." Silence. Then my mother's voice, now unmistakably on speaker. "You self-righteous little thing," she snapped. Even at 79, Mama could make little sound like an insult. You've always been jealous of your sister. That almost made me laugh. Jealousy requires wanting what someone else has. I had stopped wanting Rebecca's life years ago. Put Rebecca on, I said. A rustle of movement. Then my sister's voice ragged and furious. You planned this. No, I said evenly. I prepared for it. What does that even mean? It means the trust reverted because you violated transfer restrictions. She gave a bitter laugh. That's ridiculous. Daddy gave me control. No, Daddy gave you appearance. The words landed hard. I could feel it in the sudden quiet that followed. For all her life, Rebecca had mistaken appearance for reality. Beauty for worth. Charm for substance. Attention for love. This was simply the first time the distinction had cost her something measurable. You're lying, she whispered. I'm not. I could picture her now standing in some ornate Charleston sitting room mascara, smudged, one manicured hand pressed to her forehead, while panic made her prettier features look strangely childish. She had always looked younger than her years. Not because life had been kind. Because she had never truly had to grow up. Why would Daddy do this, she asked. I heard the crack in her voice then. Not anger. Fear. And beneath that confusion so deep it almost sounded like grief. I closed my eyes for a moment. Because despite everything, she was still my little sister. The same child who used to curl against my shoulder during thunderstorms and whisper, "Don't let the lightning get me." No one is born spoiled. It is taught. Federal. Protected. Refined into identity. And if Rebecca had become exactly what our parents rewarded, then some part of what happened next belonged to all of us. Because he knew, I said quietly. Knew what? That someone might try to use you to reach the company. The line went dead silent. Then I heard it. A man's voice in the background. Low. Smooth. Marcus. Even through the speaker, I recognized that polished confidence. Rebecca, hang up. Interesting. Not denial. Instruction. I sat straighter. There it was. Confirmation. He was there. Still trying to control the room. Put Marcus on, I said. Rebecca hesitated. Then Marcus came on, all calm Southern courtesy. Evelyn, I think there's been some confusion here. Were you planning Palm Beach or Miami? A pause. Tiny. But enough. Excuse me. You told Rebecca selling Carter acreage would fund your development venture. His silence sharpened. You've been courting private lenders for 6 months. You're leveraged past recovery, and your boutique hotel project is bleeding cash. Another pause. This one longer. Then his tone cooled. You've been snooping. No, I said. I've been doing what I've always done. Protecting the family. Even from itself. He gave a short laugh. That company isn't yours. No, I agreed. It belongs to the people who built it, which excludes men who marry toward opportunity. His breath hitched almost imperceptibly. A nerve struck cleanly. Good. When he spoke again, the charm was gone. You have no idea who you're dealing with. At 61, threats from younger men rarely impress. Mostly they sound exhausting. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, I said. And if I were you, I'd be less concerned with me than with what your creditors will do once they realize that $8 million isn't coming. I hung up before he could answer. I sat there another 10 minutes, letting the quiet settle. Then I pulled back onto the highway and headed north. For the first hour, my phone stayed mercifully silent. Then Daddy called again. This time his voice sounded older. Not angry. Worn down. Whitaker says we need to meet Monday. James Whitaker had been Carter family counsel for 32 years. If he was involved, things had moved quickly. Where? His office, 9 o'clock. I nodded, though he couldn't see me. I'll be there. He hesitated. Then softly. Evelyn, did I make a mistake? The question startled me. Not because of what he asked. Because of how small he sounded asking it. For most of my life, Harold Carter had spoken like a man reading law from stone tablets. Certainty was his native language. Hearing doubt in his voice felt like watching a mountain apologize for standing. I chose my words carefully. You made several. He exhaled sharply. But this wasn't one of them. He said nothing after that. just breathed. Then quietly ended the call. Night had fallen by the time I crossed into Ohio. The familiar roads felt steadier beneath my tires. Cornfields stretched dark and endless beneath a sky scattered with cold stars. Home. I had nearly reached Chillicothe when Rebecca called again. I almost let it ring out. But something made me answer. Her voice was different now. Thin. Shaking. He's gone. I frowned. What? Marcus. She sucked in a trembling breath. The housekeeper came this evening. The closets are empty. His bags are gone. My stomach sank, though I cannot say I was surprised. What else? A sob escaped her. The sound was raw and small and terribly young. My jewelry's gone, the cash gifts from the wedding, Daddy's Rolex from the rehearsal dinner. She stopped to breathe, then whispered, "There's a note." I gripped the wheel tighter. What does it say? For several seconds she couldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. It says, "You should have read the paperwork too." And in that moment, for the very first time in her life, my sister understood exactly what it means to be chosen for all the wrong reasons. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of Ohio autumn morning that makes the world feel stripped down to essentials. By 8:30, I was seated in the reception area outside James Whitaker's office, holding a paper cup of weak coffee and watching drizzle stripe the courthouse windows across Main Street. I had not slept much, not because I was worried. That part had passed. No, what kept me awake was something stranger, a heaviness I couldn't quite name. For years I had imagined this day. The moment truth finally reached my family. The moment Rebecca and our parents would be forced to see what had been there all along. I had imagined satisfaction, vindication, maybe even a touch of triumph. Instead, sitting there in that quiet office with fluorescent lights humming overhead, all I felt was sadness. There is no joy in watching illusions die, even when they deserve to. At exactly 8:58, the elevator doors opened. My family stepped out. And for the first time in my life, they looked ordinary. Not polished. Not composed. Not untouchable. Just tired people wearing the remains of old certainty. Daddy looked 10 years older than he had at the wedding. His cream-colored confidence had been replaced by a charcoal suit that hung too loosely on his frame. Mama's lipstick was uneven and she clutched her handbag like it might explain things if held tightly enough. And Rebecca, for a moment I barely recognized her. She wore no makeup. Her blonde hair, usually styled within an inch of perfection, was pulled back carelessly. Her face looked thinner, somehow stripped of all the little performances beauty had always provided. She looked 42 for the first time in her life. And strangely enough, she looked more real than she ever had. No one spoke. James's secretary led us into the conference room. The same room where 32 years earlier Daddy had signed papers buying his first soybean property. The same walnut table. The same leather chairs. History has a way of circling back to where it began. James Whitaker entered precisely at 9. At 71, he still carried himself like a man who trusted clocks more than people. He nodded to each of us and sat at the head of the table. Then he folded his hands. "Well," he said, "I imagine this has been an educational weekend." No one answered. Good. James disliked unnecessary theatrics. He opened a thick file folder. "Mrs. Hale," Carter Rebecca said quietly. James paused, raised one eyebrow. "Interesting." He nodded once and continued. "Rebecca Carter, on March 14th of last year, you executed conditional succession documents concerning Carter Agricultural Holdings. I signed what Daddy told me to sign." "Yes," James said. "That has long been your habit." The room stiffened. Even Mama looked startled. James rarely allowed himself sharpness. That he did now told me exactly how much he had quietly observed over the years. He adjusted his glasses. The trust terms were explicit. Any attempt to liquidate protected agricultural holdings without trustee approval would trigger immediate asset reversion. Rebecca looked at Daddy. "You knew." His face crumpled. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Then finally whispered, "Yes." She stared at him as though seeing a stranger. "You let me believe it was all mine." His hands trembled against the table. "I hoped you'd grow into it." Her laugh was small and broken. You hoped. No one answered. James slid several documents across the table. The $8 million was automatically transferred into secured corporate reserve the moment unauthorized sale instructions were entered Friday afternoon. Rebecca's face went white. Marcus submitted them. James nodded. Using your digital authorization credentials. She stared at the papers. Then slowly sat back. Something in her changed right there. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like ice finally admitting it is water. She looked at me. And for the first time in our entire lives there was no competition in her eyes. Only bewilderment. How long, she asked. I knew what she meant. How long had I known? How long had I protected them? How long had this invisible architecture existed beneath the life she thought she understood? 25 years, I said. The word settled heavily into the room. Mama frowned. What are you talking about? I looked at her. Really looked at her. The beautiful woman who had spent decades polishing Rebecca into proof of her own worth while treating me like practical furniture. And I felt something close to pity. Daddy nearly lost the company in 1999, I said. Her expression flickered. She hadn't known. Of course she hadn't. I continued. I restructured the debt. Daddy lowered his eyes. The Charleston condo. Rebecca thought Marcus bought outright. I negotiated the bridge financing. Rebecca stared. The boutique losses, the IRS audit, the refinancing on your vacation property after the market crash. I turned to Mama. I handled all of it. Her mouth parted slightly. James said nothing. He didn't need to. Truth was doing its own work now. Rebecca looked back at me, tears gathering. Why didn't anyone tell me? There it was. The real question. Not about money. About identity. About how a woman wakes at 42 and discovers the life she thought she built was quietly carried by someone else's hands. I answered as gently as I could. Because no one wanted to ruin your perfect reflection. The tears spilled then. Not graceful ones. Not pretty ones. Real grief. Rebecca bent forward and wept into her hands. And no one moved to comfort her. Not because we were cruel. Because some heartbreak must be endured without rescue if it is ever to become wisdom. After several minutes, she looked up. Her face was blotched and honest. She turned to me and whispered the last thing I ever expected to hear. I'm sorry. 2 words. Simple. Unadorned. And more valuable than all $8 million. For a long moment I could not answer. Because I suddenly understood something profound. This was not the collapse of the golden child. This was the birth of my sister. When the meeting ended, none of us moved right away. The conference room sat in a silence so complete I could hear the old radiator ticking behind the wall. Outside the tall courthouse windows, rain drifted steadily over Main Street, softening the town into blurred patches of gray and amber. People hurried beneath umbrellas. Cars passed through puddles with that familiar Ohio hiss. Ordinary life. The kind that keeps moving no matter what private worlds are falling apart behind closed doors. James Whittaker gathered his papers carefully and stood. I believe he said quietly that everything needing explanation has now been explained. Then he looked directly at Rebecca. What happens next is no longer legal. He nodded once and left the room. No speeches. No courtroom drama. Just a lawyer who had spent 32 years watching one family mistake performance for truth, and knew his work here was finished. For several moments no one spoke. Then Daddy rose slowly from his chair. At 83 his movements had acquired the deliberate caution of age, but today there was something else there too, uncertainty. He looked at Rebecca, then at me. And for the first time in my life, he seemed like a man who did not know which daughter needed him most. It was a terrible thing to witness. And an honest one. Evelyn, he said softly. I looked up. His eyes were wet. Not with the frustrated anger I had known all my life. With regret. I was wrong. I had imagined hearing those words from him more times than I could count. Usually in my fantasies they brought release. Validation. Something clean and satisfying. Instead they landed quietly like autumn leaves settling into grass. Because by 61 you understand that apologies do not restore years. They only illuminate what cannot be returned. I gave him a small nod. Not forgiveness, not rejection, simply acknowledgement. He seemed to understand. Then he turned and walked from the room with Mama following close behind, her usual certainty gone. She looked back once before the door closed. Her face was unreadable. Good. Some truths need time to settle before they can be named. That left Rebecca and me alone at the walnut table. For a long moment neither of us spoke. She stared down at her folded hands. The expensive manicure was chipped now. One thumbnail had broken clean across. Such a tiny detail. And yet somehow it moved me more than all the tears. For once she looked like someone who had tried and failed and not known how to hide it. Finally she lifted her eyes. I really didn't know. I believed her. That was the hardest part. Deception implies awareness. Rebecca had not deceived herself. She had simply been raised inside a story so flattering she never thought to question it. No, I said gently. You didn't. She let out a long breath and nodded. Then she asked something that startled me. Did you ever hate me? The question hung between us. Outside, rain whispered against the windows. Somewhere down the hall a phone rang and was quickly answered. Life continuing. Always continuing. I thought carefully before answering. Because after everything she deserved the truth. No, I said at last. Her face crumpled slightly. I continued. I hated what we were taught to become. Tears filled her eyes again, but she didn't look away. When we were little, she said quietly, I used to think you knew everything. I smiled despite myself. That's because I was 9 years older. No, she shook her head. You always seemed steady, like nothing could knock you over. I almost laughed. If only she knew how often I had stood in my kitchen after balancing company crises all day and cried over burnt casseroles simply because they gave me something harmless to mourn. Strength looks different from the outside. Mostly it just looks quiet. She wiped her eyes. I'm sorry I let them make me that person. There was no performance in it. No expectation of absolution. Just grief honestly spoken. And because of that, I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. For the first time since she was a frightened little girl during thunderstorms, she squeezed back. That was enough. No dramatic reconciliation. No tearful embrace. Just contact. Real and human and unadorned. Sometimes healing begins with less than words. I left 10 minutes later and began the drive home to Chillicothe. The rain had stopped by then. Clouds broke open over southern Ohio in long silver ribbons of light, and by the time I reached Circleville, the western sky was burning orange behind the fields. I rolled the window down despite the cold. Harvest air rushed in earth-corn stubble wood smoke from somewhere distant. Home. The farther north I drove, the lighter I felt. Not victorious. Not vindicated. Simply released. There is a difference. Victory depends on someone losing. Release asks nothing at all. Night had fallen by the time I pulled into my driveway. The farmhouse sat quiet beneath the porch light, warm and waiting. I carried my overnight bag inside, fed the cat, and stood for a long moment at the kitchen window looking out over the dark fields beyond the barn. Then the phone rang. Rebecca. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice was calmer now, almost shy. Hi. Hi. A pause. Then, could I visit sometime? I waited. No lawyers, she said quickly. No business talk, no family mess. Another pause. Then softly. Just coffee. I looked out at the darkness settling over the rows of winter wheat. Thought of 2 little girls hiding from thunderstorms. Thought of all that had been wasted. And all that still remained. I'd like that, I said. Her breath caught. Then she whispered, Thank you. After we hung up, I stood there smiling faintly into the quiet house. And for the first time in many years, tomorrow felt like something worth setting an extra cup out for. Rebecca arrived 6 months later on a quiet April morning. The sun had only just begun lifting itself over the eastern ridge, and pale gold light spilled across the back pasture in long, soft stripes. Dew clung to the grass. Somewhere beyond the barn, my neighbor's rooster was announcing himself to a world that had not asked. I was already awake. At 61, sleep becomes more suggestion than guarantee. I had been sitting on the porch with my first cup of coffee watching mist rise off the fields and wondering whether she would actually come. Rebecca had called twice over those 6 months. Short conversations. Careful ones. No false brightness. No polished socialese. Sometimes she simply asked how my garden was doing. Sometimes she told me about her new job assisting second-grade teachers at a public elementary school outside Charleston. The work paid almost nothing compared to the life she had known, but her voice sounded steadier each time she spoke of it, as though simplicity had finally given her something luxury never could: enoughness. When her rental car turned up the gravel drive, I set down my mug and stood. For a moment she just sat behind the wheel, looking at the house. At the porch swing Daddy built when I was 22. At the flower beds Mama once mocked for being too practical to impress anyone. Then she opened the door and stepped out. I hardly recognized her. She wore faded jeans, work boots, and a plain gray sweatshirt with the school district's logo stitched over the chest. No diamonds. No designer handbag. No careful Charleston armor. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and she had the faint shadows beneath her eyes of someone who had finally started living honestly enough to grow tired. She looked older, and infinitely better. For a second neither of us spoke. Then she smiled. A small, uncertain smile. The kind children give when they are trying hope again after disappointment. "Morning." I smiled back. "Morning." She climbed the porch steps. For one impossible moment I thought she might hug me. Instead she stopped, awkwardly shifting her weight. "I brought coffee beans from that little shop you liked near campus, Ohio State." I blinked. The memory surprised me. I had taken her there once when she was 16 and visiting Columbus with friends. I remembered almost nothing about the trip except how bored she had seemed. Apparently I was wrong. She held out the small brown bag. I took it. "Thank you." She shrugged lightly, suddenly looking 15 again. I remembered. And there it was. The first quiet proof that all those years beneath the glitter and entitlement and family noise, some part of my sister had been paying attention after all. "Come sit," I said. We settled into the porch chairs with fresh coffee between us. For a while we said nothing. Just watched the morning unfold across the fields. A breeze moved through the sycamores. Somewhere down the road a dog barked twice and settled again. Rebecca wrapped both hands around her mug. "This is nice." "It usually is." She smiled faintly. Then after a moment she said, "I sold the condo." I glanced at her. "How do you feel about that?" She thought for a moment. "Lighter." I nodded. "That's usually how letting go works." She looked out across the pasture. "Mom and Dad are still going to counseling." That surprised me. Mama had always considered introspection something other people needed. "How's that going?" Rebecca smiled sadly. Messily. That sounded about right. She took another sip. "Daddy writes me letters now." I raised an eyebrow. "Letters." She laughed softly. Apparently therapy taught him email lacks sincerity. That startled an honest laugh out of me. The sound felt strange and wonderful in the morning air. Rebecca smiled at hearing it. Then she grew thoughtful. "He writes you too, you know." "I know." I had received 4 so far. Careful, awkward letters full of weather observations and quiet apologies tucked sideways between practical updates about the company. I answered each one. Briefly. Healing, I was learning, often arrives disguised as ordinary correspondence. After a while, Rebecca stood and looked toward the side garden. The mulch beds had badly needed refreshing after winter. Without a word, she walked down the porch steps toward the tool shed. I watched her go. A few minutes later, she returned carrying gloves and a rake. She looked at me with quiet uncertainty. "Mind if I help?" "No performance. No request for approval. Just a simple offer." I nodded once. And together we spent the next 3 hours working the garden. No grand conversations. No dramatic confessions. Just the scrape of rake tines through dark soil, the smell of fresh mulch, and the steady companionship of shared labor. At one point I glanced over and saw her pause to push wind-blown hair from her face with the back of a dirt-streaked wrist. And suddenly she looked exactly like the little sister who used to follow me through summer fields, determined to keep up no matter how fast I walked. Something inside me softened completely then. Not because the past had disappeared. It hadn't. Not because everything was fixed. It wasn't. But because understanding had finally arrived where approval once lived. And understanding, I have learned, is the truer inheritance. By noon we were finished. I went inside and poured 2 fresh cups of coffee. When I returned to the porch, Rebecca was sitting quietly in the sunlight, looking out across the fields, as though she had discovered a country she had somehow overlooked all her life. I handed her the second cup. She smiled up at me. And this time no words were needed. Tomorrow morning I thought I'll set out 2 cups again.